Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everybody, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and today we have the perfect segue between football season and basketball season. That's because just a few weeks ago, the Indiana Hoosiers football team capped off their seasons with a 16-0 record, and that, combined with what we're about to talk about, gives them the dubious distinction right now of having the two last undefeated men's basketball and football teams in NCAA sports. The last undefeated season in football for the men's champion was 16-0 with Indiana. And we're about to talk about what happened to the basketball team. The last perfect season for NCAA basketball was Indiana in the 1975 and 1976 season. So let's get into it. If you're my age, you might remember this. Now, I don't, because obviously I was pretty young when this happened, but I did read about it over the years and already had it marked down as the first basketball topic of the new season for basketball on GenX Classic Sports. But what the Indiana football team did just made it even sweeter to be the first topic. So if you're about my age or a little bit older of a Gen Xer, you definitely remember that no matter how many teams come close, no matter how many dominant modern powerhouse teams we have, no matter how many games are played, there's only one 76 Indiana Hoosiers, 32 wins, 0 losses, and the national championship. That's right, they're the last undefeated men's team in NCAA Division I basketball history. And here's the thing, this wasn't really just some typical feel-good Cinderella story kind of thing. This was from discipline and being under a ton of pressure and yet having to be in control. And that all kind of describes the way Coach Bobby Knight handled this at the peak of his coaching powers. So today, let's go back to Bloomington and to Assembly Hall and to the season college basketball has been chasing for 50 years. So to understand how Indiana did this, you got to understand when they did it. Okay, this is pre-3-point line. There was no shot clock, no one-and-done players leaving for the NBA. Starters or players hung around for 4 years. Coaches were the absolute law among their teams. You know, the players weren't running the show. Defense wasn't optional at this point in college basketball. It was a major requirement for good programs. The Big Ten was a grind, slow games, physical play, road trips, and these hostile old gyms where nothing came easy. And the NCAA tournament back then, it was only 32 teams. So there was no safety net. Lose once and you're out as usual in the NCAA tournament. So perfection at that point was pretty hard to come by, for sure. So let's talk about the guy who orchestrated this whole thing, Coach Bobby Knight. By 1975-1976 season, he was already a force of nature, okay? He was 35 years old. He was in around his 5th season as a head coach in Indiana, and he had already been to a Final Four with them. He was, later on, he was an Olympic gold medal coach. He was obsessive about preparation, and he was demanding sometimes beyond all reason. He believed in relentless defense, precision passing, and mental toughness above anything else. And Indiana just didn't practice their plays. They practiced how to respond when everything went wrong. And Knight actually told his team before the season, we can be undefeated. And that to me is stunning. I don't know if I've ever heard of a coach flat out telling his team at that level with that much on the line that with 30 plus games ahead of you that they're going to be undefeated. It wasn't really just bravado. It was a challenge to him, I suppose. And so I find that really interesting that he told them before the season, that he pretty much expected or thought they could go undefeated. Now, what you need to understand about going into the 1975-76 season is what happened the year before. The year before, in the 75 NCAA tournament, Indiana went into that with a 29-0 record. Okay, so they were on their way to an undefeated championship the year before. And I believe I read that one of their players broke his arm or something. One of their key players broke his arm and was lost. So they got beat by Kentucky in the Elite Eight in Dayton, Ohio, the season before after being undefeated. So they were 30-plus wins and lost in the Elite Eight to Kentucky. So going into the 75-76 season, he verbalized to them that they were going to not only avenge that 1975 loss, they were going to avenge that entire 1975 season, and they were going to aim for the perfect season and the national title. UCLA had previously been undefeated and gotten a national title 4 times. But Bobby straight up told his team they could do it. So anyway, this wasn't like a UCLA with the dominance of a player like Kareem, and it wasn't flashy. This was all about balance, toughness, defense, and so forth. So the Indiana had Scott May, who was a leader, scorer, steady presence on the team. Quinn Buckner, tough, fearless, a defensive star. Kent Benson, size, consistency inside. Bobby Wilkerson, versatile, athletic, dependable. They had a good roster, but not exactly household names for sure. They didn't chase stats, and nobody freelanced. This was Bobby Knight. You didn't freelance on Bobby Knight. Every possession had a purpose, and Indiana didn't beat teams by overwhelming them or outrunning them up and down the court. They suffocated them, okay? They played team ball, and even their most talented players were perfectly willing to share the ball and responsibilities because they knew that was better for the team because that had been drilled into them by Bobby Knight. It's important to remember that, some coaches have enough personality, pull, presence, authority, whatever you want to call it. They have enough of that they can convince even superstars to, I don't want to say superstars aren't team players, but they can convince them to do something by taking a step back some nights or whatever. Maybe you're not going to score tonight. It's going to be your defense. Maybe you're not going to play defense so much, but it's going to be your rebound. Whatever the case may be, Bobby Knight definitely was probably the type of person that could take 7 or 8 really talented people and have them do what's best for the team pretty much at all times. So they started the 75-76 season as the consensus number 1 in the country. Now, I always try to bring y'all some trivia. So one interesting piece of trivia about this team, I find this pretty fascinating. So this is 1975. They played in the preseason, against the Soviet team that had won the 1972 Olympics with all that controversy against the U.S., So 3 years after the Olympics, the Soviets team is still pretty much together. They scheduled them in the preseason, and they beat them 94-78. So that was a pretty good way to start off the preseason. Their first game of the season against a collegiate opponent that counted was against number 2 UCLA, who was the defending national champions. And it was going to be UCLA's first game without their legendary coach, John Wooden, of course. So NBC created this whole must-see TV viewing event around this basketball game. It was the first college basketball game set up beforehand to tout what they all knew was going to happen, which would be 2, they figured in the top 5 type teams, but it turned out to be number 1 and number 2 with the national champions thrown in there. So that was a big TV event. Indiana beat the defending champion UCLA Bruins by 20 points, 84-64. So they're off to a strong start for the season. And so obviously they won early, and it never stopped. Every road game, even though road games are such traps, especially in conference play, they went through them, and every opponent wanted to be that one to finally slow the train down, right? Well, the Hoosiers never blinked. They beat 8th-ranked Notre Dame early in the season. They beat Kentucky early in the season. They won the close games. They won the ugly games. They won the games where shots didn't fall whatsoever. They won the blowout games. And all of that to say that, I've always heard that defense travels in pretty much any sport, really. At pitching, defense in football and defense in basketball travels. So the way to shut down a loud arena is to play defense. So, yeah, that held true for them. Defense traveled. Discipline got them through those ugly wins. And so by February, it was already clear that this wasn't just a great team. This had a chance to be a historically great team. So let's get to the NCAA tournament, where it had recently expanded, I don't know, maybe the year before, up to 32 teams, okay? Not like what we're used to now. This was a 32-team tournament. So the margins are going to disappear now. Of course, you lose and you go home, but you're obviously going to play somebody pretty good in every round of this tournament. So the quarterfinals, the semis, every game was getting a little bit tougher. And so let's take a look at the complete list of teams that. Now, remember, the calendar flips, so the 75-76 season. So this is after January. This is after January 1. So we're now in the postseason of 1976. So in the regional first round, they played St. John's, and this was held at Notre Dame's arena, and Indiana won 90-70. They beat them by 20. In the Mideast Regional semifinal, they played Alabama, and it was a close one, with Indiana only winning 74-69, and that game was held in Baton Rouge. And I think I read in all the research somewhere where Bobby Knight said Alabama absolutely played them the toughest game they played all year and could have easily beaten them. In the Mideast Regional final, they played Marquette, once again in Baton Rouge, and they beat them by 9 points, 65-56. So now we move to the Final Four, and that was in Philadelphia at the Spectrum where the Sixers played, all right? And so in the semis, who shows back up again but UCLA, sorry. Indiana and UCLA. So UCLA has overcome, obviously, the first game of the year loss. They've breezed their way into the final. I say breezed. I don't really know what their record was, but it was good enough that, and they were hot enough on a streak to be in the Final Four. So in this semifinal, Indiana beat them by 14. So that's twice that they've handled the defending national champions. And that set up a showdown with Michigan in the finals national championship game, and they beat Michigan 86-68, okay? These 5 wins in the tournament completed the undefeated national title run, and it's still the last perfect season in NCAA Division I. I've said that about 3 times now. Let's take a look at how this kind of happened for them a little bit, just a few key moments round by round in the NCAA tournament. So round one was against St. John's, and not much to report there. Indiana jumped out on them early, and Scott May had a big game. They jumped out early, and they never looked back on their way to the 90-70 victory over St. John's in round one. A little bit of a statement game because apparently Indiana had a really good day moving the ball around, making the extra pass and so forth. So their patience paid off, and they kind of had a little statement win there to start the tournament, which is what you want, right? Round 2 was not that way. They played Alabama, and this was the 5-point victory, 74-69. But Alabama played such a tough and grinding and physical style of play that it really kept the game close throughout. And it was really for the first time in a while that Indiana had faced that kind of real pressure. And so apparently Quinn Buckner, he had a good game on defense, and his leadership was critical to them in that game. And, no panic on the part of Indiana. They just did their jobs, and they got by with what Bobby Knight said was one of their toughest games, or the toughest game of the year, 74-69, moving on. Round 3, Indiana versus Marquette. So this was Al McGuire's Marquette team. So this will, I'm sure Bobby Knight considered this a little bit of a chess match kind of thing. A much slower paced game, which is what Indiana kind of wanted. And so Indiana's defense led them the way in this one. They really smothered Marquette's outside game. And Kent Benson for Indiana, he was steady on the inside for them that game, leading the team in scoring and rebounding. And so later in the game, after keeping it kind of close, the Hoosiers pulled away, relying on their discipline, their patience, their defense, and so forth. And they went away with the win, 65-56 over Almaguer and Marquette. Next up was UCLA, and they were obviously not happy that they had lost the first game of the season to Indiana. This game was played at the Spectrum, as I've mentioned. This was still a measuring stick for Indiana because if you think about it, they had won in a big TV match, sure, but it didn't mean anything compared to the postseason. So here they are, NCAA tournament, the Final Four semifinal. So UCLA held the Bruins to 51 points, which is kind of an astonishingly low number in a tournament game like that. Indiana's defense apparently frustrated UCLA throughout that game. A lot of poor shots, a lot of turnovers, a lot of frustration, and so forth. And so, in a way, that was, you can look at it symbolically if you want to. There's a lot of that in sports. But John Wooden had retired. This was their first team post John Wooden. And so, with what Indiana had done to them twice that season now, it kind of feels like Bobby Knight had sort of snatched the mantle away from UCLA pretty severely there in 1976. So anyway, you can look at it that way if you want to. And so some people thought this was their most impressive win of the season, regardless of the fact that Knight thought the Alabama game was a little tougher. Anyway, Indiana wins in the Final Four 65-51 over UCLA. And now we're going to talk about the finals. In the finals, they played Michigan. Well, if you know anything about sports back then, or college sports back then, you know that meant these two were Big Ten rivals. And so that they had already played each other twice that season. And despite everything I told you about how tough the UCLA game was and how tough the Alabama game was, they had beaten Michigan twice that season, and once by 5 points and once by 6 points. So Michigan was a quality opponent, like big time. I don't know who that gave the advantage to, honestly. If you've beaten somebody twice, it's hard to beat anybody 3 times in a season in any sport, I would imagine. Baseball, if you play somebody 30 times, maybe so. But football and basketball, I would think it's a little difficult if you've already beaten somebody twice. There's a lot of psychology that goes into that on both sides. In football, they say you just can't do it, and the basketball may be a little different. I don't know. But they're playing their in-conference rival, Michigan, in the finals at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. I believe it was around March 29th. So nobody was going to be intimidated by the other team because they knew each other so well. And apparently, Indiana played their best offensive game of the tournament. Scott May, who we'll talk about in a minute, delivered a dominant performance, leading all scores. Indiana was very balanced, and they overwhelmed Michigan's guards and their front court. And, they just executed well. From what I've read, they just executed well. Indiana wasn't flashy. They just did their jobs. And the final score was 86-68 Indiana. And that caused the last undefeated national championship that we've seen in college sports, 32-0. We may never see that again. Who knows? During the regular season, Indiana had beat teams ranked number 2, number 8, number 14, number 17, and number 19. And in the NCAA tournament, their 5 wins were against teams ranked 17, 6, 2, 5, and 9. So they had played a tough schedule that season for sure. And so let's think about it in the 50 years ago perspective, okay? And since then, 5 teams have ended the regular season undefeated, but then lost in the postseason, okay? That's happened 5 times. One of them was Larry Bird's Indiana State team in 1979. Most recently, Gonzaga, I think they were 30 or 31-0 and 20 or 21 somewhere, 2021. before losing in the final. So, yes, teams have gotten to the tournament undefeated, but nobody since then has gotten through it undefeated. The tournament is bigger. They play more games in the regular season. There's now early NBA departures like one and dones. There's a faster pace. The three-point line is there. The conditioning is better. The weightlifting is there, and all that is better. And so it's quite the feat, and not done by a bunch of scrubs either. Let's talk a little bit about some of the players on that team. First, let me read you the roster. All right, so the roster that season was made up of Bob Wilkerson, who was a senior guard. Quinn Buckner was a senior guard. Wayne Radford was a sophomore guard. Jim Wisman was a sophomore guard. Bob Bender was a freshman guard. Scott Eels, a 6'9" forward, freshman. Mark Haymore, a 6'8" sophomore, freshman, or forward center. Tom Abernathy was a 6'7" senior. Rich Balavicius was a 6'5" forward, freshman. Scott May, the 6'7" forward and a senior. Jim Robertson was a center, 6'9", a freshman. Jim Cruz was a guard, 6'5", senior. And Kent Benson was a center, 6'11", and a junior. Now, here's what's important about that team. You wonder who did all of this. Well, here's how those guys fared in the NBA draft. Now, not all of them were seniors. It took a few years for all these guys to get drafted. But in 1976, after the tournament, in the first round, the number 2 pick overall was Scott May, picked by the Chicago Bulls. In the same first round, pick number 7 was Quinn Buckner to the Milwaukee Bucks. In 76, the same draft, round 1, pick 11, Bob Wilkerson went to the Seattle Supersonics. So then in the third round, at pick 43 overall, Tom Abernathy went to the Los Angeles Lakers. So that means 4 players on this team went in the first through third round. 3 first rounders and a third rounder. 4 guys, the top 43 picks in the NBA draft. Folks, that's how you win a national championship right there. But in addition to them, the following season, underclassmen who then moved up in 77, Kent Benson was drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks, number 1 overall. In 1978, an underclassman who had moved up and served his 4 years, Wayne Radford, was picked in the second round overall, number 27 by the Pacers. And in 1979, Bob Bender was picked in the 6th round. So 7 guys off of that roster of 12 guys were picked in the NBA. All of them but one in the first 3 rounds. Incredible. Just incredible. Okay. Some of the awards those guys got. Kent Benson was NCAA men's MVP one year. Bob Knight was the Big Ten Coach of the Year. Scott May, National Player of the Year. Scott May, Big Ten Player of the Year. What does all that mean? What all that means is that in the modern game, the way history looks back on everything from the modern game backwards, the 76 Hoosiers, they're not a footnote in any way, shape, or form. They're actually the line in the sand. Every team since them, every undefeated team that goes farther and farther into the season is measured against them. And of course, they've all fallen short. And for Gen X fans, this really wasn't just hype. This was basketball. This was Bobby Knight running his program. This was Bobby Knight kind of coaching the individualism out of his guys. And, that's the great thing about some of these coaches, especially for basketball. They coach the individualism out of them overall, but then that talent is always there to be called upon when needed. I mean, the joke is Dean Smith held Michael Jordan to under 20 points a night. I think he averaged something like 16 or 18 in college. But, there were nights he called upon him to do more than that. And Bobby Knight was the same way with his guys. Any given night, Quinn Buckner or Scott May or any of the other guys could have been the scoring guy. And like I said earlier, they kind of just shared responsibilities. And, they were really, really good at what they did. And despite having all that talent that I just told you about, you still have to have someone running the show. And Bobby Knight was the right guy at the right time with the right group of guys. And I don't know if I mentioned his name or not, but he was only 35 years old that season. And just think about it. He was 35 years old. He had a complete undefeated season, but the year before he had a complete undefeated regular season and lost in the postseason. So his team across 2 seasons had lost 1 game at that stretch in his career. That's really having command of your job. And that's also being able to recruit and retain, really good players to do what they do. And so I just thought, here we are kicking off basketball season. The story of the 1975-1976 Indiana Hoosiers was interesting. And then when the Indiana men's football team won a couple of weeks ago, I knew for sure I was going to lead the basketball discussion with this, since they have that ownership of that trivia right now between their men's football and between their football and their men's basketball teams. So, I thought that was neat. And so we're going to kick off basketball with this one. Football's behind us now for a few months, and we'll continue on with more basketball for you next week. I've got high school stories coming up. I've got professional stories coming up. And so we're going to have a good time with basketball for a while. And if you like what we do here, please share with others that are sports fanatics what we do. And, I don't care what age they are. I don't care if they're male, female, or whatever. Just tell somebody that enjoys sports. And especially if they're of a certain age, maybe they'll get a kick out of this, strolling down memory lane every week. So give us a like and a comment and tell people about us. We'd appreciate it. So I'll talk to you in a week. This has been Sean Enos on GenX Classic Sports. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.